Okay, this is Jonathan Redding, my partner. I'm Ketna Patel, and we are the, Hai Ching's given us this very lofty grown-up title, the Cultural Envoys of Britindia, right? So I think we're going to grow into this title. But really, I'm Indian. I'm British Indian. My nationality is British, but I'm ethnically Indian. Although I grew up in East Africa, I was born in Uganda, grew up in Kenya, moved to London when I was 14, lived here for 10 years, and then have spent the last 21 years in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And for the last 4 years, I've been spending a lot of time in India and Britain. And John, go on, John.
Yeah.
We'll do a...
I was born in Wales. I was referred to earlier as the Welsh wizard by Edward. Thank you for that. That's certainly something I'll consider as a career move. I've lived predominantly in Southeast Asia. I went to India when I was 18 in search of spirituality, in search of God. I reached there only to find there were many, many thousands of varieties, and I'm still kind of searching. I've lived in Singapore. I work creatively with Ketna Patel. We've had many projects together, both in India and Singapore. And now we've come back here to Britain, and I would say I'm the British half of the Brit-India connection. And perhaps if we see the slides, we'll...
Okay, your chair's kind of covering your name up a bit. Really, I think for us what Brit-India represents is an ongoing listening project. Because my background, like I said, I grew up in East Africa, and then I studied design and architecture here. And perhaps because of that, I'm just so sensitive to people or communities who haven't had their voices represented, because I come from a marginalized community, and I'm always the outsider. And I'm so used to being the outsider that I don't even think anything of it. But when I spot another outsider, I immediately recognize him or her. And I perhaps am more sensitive to that space, which has largely been neglected, just the space in which invisible people occupy. And of course, invisible means many different things. This is the place in Kingsbury where I shop for my vegetables quite regularly, and these three grannies just sit there on the same bench every Tuesday when I go. And one day I'm going to go and ask them if I can interview them, because there's a whole story there just in those three individuals. And it reminds me that was it not for an accidental act of colonization, I could have been their granddaughter or great-granddaughter living in that village that John and I are in, because a lot of these women are indeed Gujaratis. John, just jump in now, because we have so many slides to cover. Why don't you just start this one?
Again, this is showing the similarities. There's so many similarities between Britain and India. This is the goddess Durga on the left, and of course Britannia on the right. Why they both have a tree shore is quite extraordinary. Why they both have a lion as some type of consort. So this is many things are to do with mythologies. Obviously, many things go back to the Vedic cultures, and perhaps if we go on, we can talk more on that.
But really what we try and do in our work is to compress mythology, politics, popular culture, and identity onto itself, because because these things are not separate, and there are all these links. I mean, a few of the links at the bottom are examples, but nothing is separate. So when you see a car logo, when you see the logo of Alfa Romeo, for example, you know, think about it more, because it probably has its origins in some sort of esoteric branch of mythology, and that takes you into lots of other subjects. So art obviously does not exist in a vacuum. We've got a series of artworks that come out from our studio that just exemplify different aspects of identity, the fracturing of identity, how divisions cause artificial schisms. This painting represents obviously Tibet, which has been the casualty between the war, China really, China coming into Tibet and taking it in a hostile manner, and India being the kind of guardian of that Tibetan casualty. But likewise, we could talk about India and Pakistan, or we could talk even about Britain and India and the history there. So it's important to look at history and to look at partitions and barriers. British India can mean so many things to so many people, and the commodification of culture is something that cannot escape anybody either. And it is fascinating how the branding of these schisms continue to perpetuate themselves. It was very interesting to hear Manuela say that she could open up many doors because you're a foreigner. So India, again, I'm always quite amazed by this, that they don't seem to have a very aggressive relationship with the colonizers. You know, in fact, they almost treat the British as I don't know, as their long lost uncles and aunties. You know, there's that reverence and respect and familiarity, which I find quite amazing. I think Roderick was very right when he said that India is probably one of the main cultures of today that does accepting so well, and I agree with this. You know, it doesn't seem to have any inherent antagonism with its colonizer. John?
Identity, yeah. Who or what am I? About 6 or 7 years ago, I applied for some type of immigration status to be in India. And lo and behold, I did the applications, which took many, many visits to the application centres, as anyone who's tried to do that probably knows. And then suddenly I get this document in the post proclaiming that I'm now a PIO, which refers to person of Indian origin. So I kind of looked at that and thought, just a minute, I thought I was from Wales. I thought I was from Barry. And apparently it lasted a lifetime. So all of a sudden I found my identity completely being changed. As of many things, British are really not these days British. They've been changed. Sarson's vinegar, for example, has been owned by the Japanese, as is Branston pickle. I mean, these are all, you know, things that as British people we hold quite strongly. Hovis is no longer British. Even the red buses that we travel around Trafalgar Square on are owned by Spanish companies.
No, they're owned by Singapore.
Singapore owns the telecoms. I mean, it goes on and on. So this kind of identity, or who am I, what am I find this quite fascinating, because we identify so much with the body, we identify so much with our culture, our heritage, but really, if you look a lot deeper than that, and this is a project that we're beginning here in Britain, you know, everybody matters, respect all. We are all connected, and this is really what we're trying to promote now and explore with what you'll see in a minute with what we call a diary of transience. So yes, I suddenly became a person of Indian origin, which is quite pleasant, I must say.
For this presentation, we've been referencing quite a lot of quotes from E.F. Schumacher from Small is Beautiful, right? Small is Beautiful, yeah. We still have to learn how to live peacefully, not only with our fellow men, but also with nature, and above all with those higher powers which have made nature and have made us. For assuredly, we have not come about by accident, and certainly have not made ourselves. You know, this repeating theme of how superpowers or powerful positions are justified because of the economic might that they occupy globally. Like, for example, Singapore is supposed to be one of the richest countries in the world, you know, but how do we measure the cost or the casualties? And I mean, it's not always a negative thing, it's just that in that domination also lies the seed of self-destruction. In that very heightened neoliberal celebration also lies the tsunami, which is covering up lots of things that we have thrown into the ocean, metaphorically, which is just always there, hovering in the background, waiting to rise and engulf us all. We use a lot of icons that are familiar and unfamiliar deliberately to give us hooks into a larger narrative. For example, the artwork on the left is called Asian Grandfathers because if you look at the narratives of China and India, and if you look at the currency, I mean, literally, you've got these grandfathers in everybody's back pocket because every rupee note and every Chinese currency note will have Mao on it. But there've been so much violence associated with not both these individuals, but in the lifetimes of these individuals. And of course, hundreds of books have been written about them. Mao is still revered in China. But I came up with another painting, which is a bit of an antidote, which is about two housewives who are trying to heal the rift between India and China. So it's the Chinese lady is patching up some old torn clothes, and the Indian lady is offering her the house keys, saying, "Look, you can come and stay with me," as many Indian people do. You know, come stay, and. You know, you enter narratives like that, which can be playful, but just go to endorse how the healing or the unity, like John was saying, in diversity, can be done at the community level, I feel, in a more powerful way than through governments and large organizations. So as pop artists, how do we communicate that in our visuals?
Yeah, also the divide perhaps between the male and the female, the British, the Indian, this is the polarities that hopefully as we're exemplifying that.
Yeah. Again, neoliberalism, capitalism, globalization, all these big words that really underline our lives today. The biggest casualty has been individuality. How is this measured? How do the symptoms come up to the surface? As artists, what is our role as communicators? I think today a lot of artists, a lot of our friends are not the same type of artist that perhaps Picasso or Van Gogh was. You know, you don't just operate from your studio. You almost take on an activist role. So a lot of times we're known as artivists, so which is a cross between artists and activists.
I think also the platform of pop art lets you get away with quite a lot. It's even in satire or whatever. It's a great platform to kind of poke fun at people and at the same time hopefully put meaning and strong content behind it.
John?
Yeah, well, most of the work is very heavy in metaphor. I mean, to explain this, it would take a long time, but it is in fact the Wizard of Oz. If you look here, this is the great and powerful wizard. You can see him just pulling away the curtain, and the curtain is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for an illusion, or basically all the world's a stage, and we're all playing, or we're all acting out our different roles here. And the great city, the Emerald City, here in the background, you can see the Twin Towers from Malaysia, for example. So this is exemplifying city life, corporations. The yellow brick road, in fact, refers to the gold reserve, or yellow bricks of gold, which carried you to the Emerald City. On the right there's poppies. I think that opium was a word used earlier. There's Obama. He's the Tin Man, obviously looking for the oil. And anyway, so the heavy metaphor is there in just about every piece. The Man in the Moon, for example, you can see there's a rocket in the eye. This is Uncle Sam. It's a reference to one of the first science fiction movies, which was a black and white movie. The rocket is coming from China. Even the small medal that Uncle Sam is wearing, that's symbolic of a different kind of Illuminati, did I say the word? So if one was to really look into this, just about every little piece of that is symbolic. So again, that's the Wizard of Oz narrative used to show the things that we feel strongly about saying. Again, in pop art, we're using and getting away with a lot. This was a collection of work which we were using Renaissance paintings and changing the style of the Renaissance paintings, or bringing them up to date as we saw it. This is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Venetian things, exemplifying luxury items, all things that supposedly we have to aspire for. Venus was born of a shell. Venus in this instance is symbolized by America, or the West, unfortunately going through a clearance sale as the demise of what we feel Western values and corporations might be bringing us. The shell that she's born in is in fact the symbol of the Shell Oil Company, and you can see the toxic waste which is coming out of the shell and going towards the refineries in the back. On the left we have Mao, or Super Mao, who is embracing China and Japan. I don't know if embracing or controlling. And interestingly enough, you can see Mao is pulling at a green cloth or sari, and the lady on the right is in fact Draupadi. And if you know who Draupadi is from Mahabharata, there is a scene or part of Mahabharata where Draupadi was tried to be raped or disrobed. And there was an endless amount of cloth supplied by the god Krishna, which you can see in the top right-hand side corner, symbolized by his blue hand. So this is showing the tensions, or the polarities between India and China and the Western values in the middle. Anyway, perhaps we'll go on because time's limited.
These are just some recent works. I take a lot of photographs of billboards and advertising and shops and things like that, and then just collage people from the past. In a way, it's my way of compressing time, because I think a lot of stories don't get entered, but just because we are so faithful to the chronology of world events. But if you took away time, and if we just bring everything down to a single moment. It is a very powerful testimony of what is really going on. These few slides are going to show what John and I have been doing for quite a few years, which apart from our studio work, we take part in a lot of art residencies, or we help organize art residencies, where we deliberately seek out small communities, usually villages or rural areas. This particular one was in a little village called Anglo in Austria, where we were part of a festival called the CrossDrifts, and we were there for 2 weeks. Many things happen. Apart from meeting other artists, you interact, you stay with local people, and you have a brilliant time. You learn a lot about each other. So for me, the highlights of my year are usually these arts residencies, because it's live art, and you don't know what you're going to make or paint or draw or perform until you go there and you understand the situation, then you convert it into art. So,
the same village.
Yeah, this is the same village, a tiny village. I think the population was about 1,000 people. It was just like this little sleepy village where nobody locks their doors, but it happens to house one of the biggest furniture factories in Europe called AAAHA. It's like the equivalent of a kind of upmarket IKEA. And so they asked me. We just got to know in fact, the guy, the guy sitting next to the lady in green. He's the owner of AAAHA, and he just took us out to a pub for sausages one day. Of course, we're vegetarian; we didn't eat the sausages, but anyway. And the next thing I knew, he asked me if I could design headboards for this company. And so I've been on this royalty licensing collaboration with them for a few years now, where I designed that headboard, and every time they sell one, they send me a bit of money. So there are many things that come out of just people getting together, having a drink, getting to know each other, friendship. I mean, I think Hai Ching and us really, we've gotten to know each other in very informal circumstances, and I think even looking at some of our friends and collaborations from before, the more informal exchange there is right from the beginning, the juicier and richer the collaborations.
I think one of the points with this particular project was that so many people were leaving the village to get better jobs or any type of employment, in fact, in the bigger cities. And we were trying to use art, performance art, music, installations, to give back to the community some sense of community, and also to try and kind of sex up the villages, that it was actually cool to live in a village. There's so many things that you can do. You don't have to resort to going back to the big cities. So these are just some installations that we did, and you can see the local people interacting with that.
I think that was the first time that village had ever heard the sound from an Indian instrument, the sarod, which John plays. And they were, it was extraordinary just seeing their reaction. I mean, a lot of them have never even left Austria. So, yes, a lot of our projects are funded with crowdfunding campaigns, or the money that we make from selling art goes into these projects. And like Manuela was saying, it can be quite taxing to go through the grants and all that. I completely honor and appreciate the importance of councils and grants and all of that, but there is another parallel universe that a lot of us live in which sometimes these two worlds don't meet. So there's more freedom this way. This was a project that took up a lot of my last year. It was in a small village called Brunei in Himachal Pradesh. It was a project I did with a friend, Frank Kittelman, half Indian, half German, and Puneet Kaushik, another friend. The three of us curated this project, raised the money ourselves, and it involved 25 people living in this tiny village for a month. So of course the background work involved 6 months of going there and scoping it out and making sure all the facilities were available, because you're really at the foothills of the mountains. I mean, this is where the road stops. Beyond this, it's just where the goats go up to the mountains, you know. So you're really in the in a very rural part of Himachal. So this is worth saying out aloud. We are beyond politics when we engage and enter projects like this. We are in culture. This is live culture, live communities, amazing spaces. I've learned so much about myself and just about India from living in these communities. I mean, there is virtually no symptom of depression or any of the psychological ills that we often come across in urban communities. And yet, 30 people every minute move from a village to a city in India. I think by 2020, there are going to be 70, what do you call these?
Megacities.
Megacities or super cities in India.
Which are being built to accommodate this phenomenon, really.
Yeah, so I don't know who's really measuring what we're losing from all these villages being hollowed out, and like I was saying earlier, the loss of oral tradition. So what we did in this project and what we're going to show in the next few slides is a lot of these villages have empty shops. Even in the UK or any other part of the world you go to, there's just these concrete shops with metal shutters. So we asked the villagers if we could use them for a month. And for a month, each of these shops was converted into a live atelier where the artist would work from. Now, the artists came from different backgrounds. Some of us were musicians, writers, painters, filmmakers. There was a ceramic artist, pottery. There was different people doing different things. But what this shop or atelier allowed us to do was that the villagers could then come into our space, because they're so used to coming into a shop every day. So you're not working in a little studio far removed from community. You are in the community and you get to know each other, you joke with each other. Eventually they invite you for dinner and lunch and you all mess around and friendships are formed. And a few months ago I even went to one of their daughters' weddings. And I still get phone calls from them, etc. So, it's more than just the art project.
They're also participating. You can see that on the right-hand side on the wall.
Yeah.
These are sketches from the local.
Well, so what I did was I took lots of photographs of the people that were coming into the shops, and then I would sit there with my computer and make artwork that we then printed. So they are in the artwork. So the space becomes like a gallery, but they are the stars because they all recognize themselves in the artwork. And there was such a big riot. There would be so many people queuing up to get in every day because everybody wanted to. And there would be fights that would break out because somebody would say, well, why didn't you include me? And you included them, and you like them better than I, like me. And it was an experiment, but I think it was really successful. Yes, it's true. It's no good telling people they have a voice if you don't listen to them. And listening to them doesn't mean actually listening to them. You just give people a platform to express themselves and do it with a smile. And it's so much fun and so much comes out. Again, we don't have the tools to measure the wealth of what comes out. And this is something that both John and I and hopefully Britindia will be trying to do with subsequent projects. This was just to give you an idea of the excitement. This was on the grand finale. We had 4,000 people come from neighboring villages to come and see all the shops that were converted into galleries, and we had performances and we screened movies that had been made there in that month. And it was like a festival. People were sitting on the rooftops since lunchtime, and the event only started at 6 p.m. So they'd all come with their packed lunches and everything, and it was really brilliant. John?
Good old Wales. So moving on, what we hope to do is to replicate or to do these type of projects, not only in India, but also in communities which are for whatever reason have been disbanded, suffering, or just not unified anymore, and particularly in Wales, in South Wales, we had wonderful mining communities. Everybody there basically revolved at one time around going to the mines, and then when they weren't in the mines, they were in the chapel. So we have purchased a chapel in South Wales, and we're presently transforming this into an art space for performance and visual arts. This will be replicating these type of projects that have been done in India and also in Austria. Now we're bringing it full circle back home to Wales. And you can see here, these are the glory days of the mining communities here. In fact, the person at the bottom there is John Cale. So John Cale is from this small, tiny town really called Garnant. And interestingly enough, John Cale was part of the whole Andy Warhol experience. He was one of the founder members of the Velvet Underground. Then this is when Andy Warhol started to do his films. He was advised to also go into promoting music. John Cale is from Garnant. So what we're hoping to do is try and ride a little bit or capitalize on that energy perhaps, and replicate some type of Andy Warhol factory, if you like, in the chapel. And back to India, to one of the residencies.
Yeah, I think what this slide just illustrates that a lot of our lives are it's like a kind of club sandwich. You know, we spend 6 months in India, 6 months here, 6 months there, 6 months here, and both inform each other. So this just took place in February this year in Odisha. So while the Welsh thing is happening and we're battling with the planning officers and all of that, this goes on, and then a lot of our conversations are over Skype, because we're dealing, you know, we're working with people from different countries, especially Singapore and India. This project was curated by my friend Puneet Kaushik and co-curated by Rama Kumar and myself, and it ran for 2 weeks, and it was in a small village called Raghurajpur, which is about 20 minutes away from Jagannath Puri, one of the most spiritual places in India. We were each allocated an artist that we would collaborate with, and we practically lived with this artist for 2 weeks. This was my artist friend, who now calls me, his whole family calls me every 2 days. They forget about the time difference, so sometimes I have to just turn the phone off because they're calling me at 5 in the morning. But that was his living room and bedroom and everything, you know, and we had 10 days to work on a project, and the slide on the right shows you what came out at the end of it. He is a craftsperson who works with paper mache and makes toy temples, which you can see. So I converted these toy temples into temples of consumerism, and I did a whole kind of spoof on how we've become slaves and how we worship money, and you know, it's all very dry and tongue-in-cheek. This was John's artist.
This is my work. I use the concept of snakes and ladders, the game of snakes and ladders. India has a great history of board games. Chess comes from India. In fact, it's considered one of the 64 qualities of the Godhead. Krishna is an expert chess player. I guess he's an expert at everything. Chess players, he is the chess player. This is the Snakes and Ladders game. Originally it was called Muktapath. This game means the path to salvation, or the path to spiritual liberation. Snakes and Ladders was used to give young people spiritual values. It taught spiritual values. It was taken by the British, brought back to Britain, and then in Victorian times, it was very popular to have board games. I don't know how we translated it, but we eventually ended up with the game of Monopoly, which became the biggest selling game. So we've gone from a spiritually based kind of board game to one of proprietorship and monopolization. which is quite interesting. This is the studio in Singapore. So this just kind of shows you a living space or a working space that we both worked at.
We experimented in the way we lived, in the fact that we lived in a commune. So there were between 10 to 12 people living in these two large houses at all times. I don't have children, so this was a very interesting experiment in non-nuclear family living. And so lots of people would come and stay. There would always be some sort of event going on. It was like a laboratory, and it became one of the top 6 places to visit in Singapore. It was in all the guidebooks, and to the point where we had no privacy at the end, and we'd have all these American tourists turn up and stuff like that. But the reason we're showing these slides is to go back to what has been underlined over the course of the morning, in that small is beautiful. Grassroots, small individual activities, I find, are more powerful and more rewarding and more satisfactory than these big, large institutionalized things. I used to work in an architectural firm with 400 people, and I remember, because I had lunch with my bosses just a few days ago, and we're talking about the difference of the work ethic in institutions like that compared to when you're working from a small studio space. So these are just some examples to show how informal collaborations lead to heightened trust, and there's a kind of a bigger sincerity thing going on. Friendships and project collaborations live on and bring on very surprising results. Because they are not premeditated. Again, most things in capitalism, including applying for a grant or something, you need to give them projections of how much you're going to make and how are you going to market this and what's your business plan going to be and everything. And there doesn't seem to be much credence given to organic growth. And organic stuff really comes from spaces like this. Again, it was through one of those chance encounters that we ended up doing all the artwork and merchandising for the equivalent of the Indian Oscars, IFA, in the International Indian Film Academy. So they commissioned us to do all the merchandising, the stage sets, the presents given to all the stars, etc. So that was a brush with Bollywood, which was quite revealing. Yeah. This is just to show, again, talking about identity, how India, or the new India, advertises itself and how it borrows from the past. You can see there's an Aditya Birla Group shop commemorating Gandhi, and then right next to it is Express Books, and then you've got rickshaws. I mean, this is really the commodification of Indian identity. But again, it's often heavy-handed. It's too obvious. It doesn't go into spaces like this type of space Tara Purnima Douglas goes into, that I was referring to earlier. It doesn't go into the space that Carrie and Caroline goes into. It doesn't go into the spaces that Roderick was talking about. There are so many lesser-known spaces which I think are pregnant with stuff that there's a huge audience for, because a lot of us, whether we can articulate it consciously or unconsciously, we're just a little bit jaded with this whole kind of over-branded way of presenting culture. These are just examples of how it is quite easy for big companies to approach you. Once you have a certain vibe going, I was the brand ambassador for Kiehl's, so that the collaborations are there. You don't have to, you don't have to go out and get them. They will come and get you once they understand what you're doing. The key thing is to just be sincere and true to your word. So these are just some examples of fashion collaborations or work with architectural things. We worked with an Italian mosaic company to cover a Tata Nano car in mosaic. These are just different activities at the studio. The best aid to give is intellectual aid, a gift of useful knowledge. A gift of knowledge is infinitely preferable to a gift of material things. Here. The way in which we experience and interpret the world obviously depends very much indeed on the kind of ideas that fill our minds. These are quotes from E.F. Schumacher. This again is an example of the Himachal project, Shop Art Shop, in which we worked with local miniature painters who had never worked on any size larger than A4 or perhaps A3, and they painted buildings. And why not? It's not expensive, it can be done, it beautifies the village, the locals get involved, there's so much potential. So there are many, many interfaces, which we won't go into over here. The project that we're into right now, we're almost finishing. I'll let John talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, one of the many things brought over by India was some of our motor manufacturing. Aston Martin, Jaguar now is owned by India, and there's always been a fascination for British cars, predominantly the Rolls-Royce. The Rolls-Royce was such a factor with the Maharajas in India, not only with the Maharajas, but then on the bottom right there you can see one of the Indian gurus who is no longer with us, but this is Bhagavan Rajneesh or Osho, who's not claimed to fame, but he did have 100 Rolls Royces. Unfortunately, he died. He was going for 360 of them. But there's always been a fascination with Rolls Royce, with India, and therefore, this is our Rolls Royce Silver Shadow Mark II that we've painted up and about to launch actually today. It is a project called the Diary of Transience. The picture at the bottom there is, if people know, Martin spoke earlier of the Ramayana. The other great epic in India is the Mahabharata. Part of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita, it means the song celestial, or it's the conversation you see there between Krishna and Arjuna. And this all took place on a chariot. What is happening here is Krishna is taking Arjuna between two different armies, which are in fact two different families, and ultimately he begins to explain the transience of the soul and the impermanence of our material bodies and this journey that we take on. And it's in that spirit, really, that we're doing this Diary of Transience. Our chariot will be the Rolls-Royce, and there's no claims to Krishna and Arjuna here, but in spirit, we're hoping to go out and try to respect or get into local communities, unity in diversity, speak to people, share their stories, and hopefully bring about some understanding and some racial harmony as we do it. So this is where we're at the moment.
And it's actually parked outside.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to see it, Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry we've gone into our lunch hour, but we're all running a bit late. But thank you very much.